Thank you, Mr. Yan, for that informative lecture. I would now like to invite Ms. Elizabeth Joseph, who is a Linux system administrator with HP, working on the OpenStack Infrastructure team. She is also a long-time contributor to Debian and Ubuntu, and currently holds a position on the Ubuntu Community Council, and is the co-author of the official Ubuntu Book 8th edition. At her hometown in San Francisco, California, she sits on the board of directors for Partimus, a non-profit organization putting Linux-based computers into schools. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Elizabeth on stage to educate us with some of her knowledge on building a career in Foss.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for having me here today. It's really exciting to be here in Oman. I've never been to the Middle East before, so it's all been a very interesting experience. It's beautiful here, and the weather this morning was very, very nice. I was happy to wake up to that. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I work for HP as a systems administrator. My title is Automation and Tools Engineer. In Jan's talk just a few moments ago, he talked a bit about all the developers in basements who were using old computers and doing open source before having higher level jobs. And I was one of those developers in a basement. For a long time, my job wasn't really a big deal. Open source hadn't really taken off. But these days, I'm employed with HP, which is obviously a major technology company. And I spend my time the entire day working on open source software. So I wanted to come here and talk to you a bit about how I got on the path of getting into open source software, some of the things you can do in open source software to get involved, and why you would want to get involved. And then how to find a job, actually. So there are a few ways that companies make money with open source software. There are things like support and services. This is, your company specializes in a type of open source software, and then you offer support in different types of services, installations, and other things. Some companies have something called open source core, where part of their product is open source, and you can use that product the way it is. In the work that I do, we use Puppet for configuration management, and that is an open source product. Okay. I'll get closer. So some companies use an open source core, and then they have proprietary services that go on top of that. One of the things that HP does a lot is deployment and management. So I work on OpenStack, and HP has an OpenStack product. So we'll go into a company and deploy their private cloud, or work with them in a public cloud in order to help them with deployments and keeping that going. A lot of this is open source, so the companies will know how the software works, and they can be familiar with how the product is interacting with their environment. But you can have a third-party company come in and actually do the management of that. So why would you want a job in open source? One way a lot of people start getting involved with software is they want to fix something that's a problem for them. So they've found an open source tool that's valuable. Perhaps they're using it in production or development, and then they want to expand upon it or improve it in some way. They may have found a bug, or there's a feature they wanted to add. We heard earlier this morning about how you can change open source software. You don't need to ask for permission. You don't need to go through vendor negotiations. You can improve it yourself, hire developers to do that. So you don't need to ask someone to make an improvement. So this is probably the most common way that people and companies get involved. They also then submit the patch back to the open source project, because carrying a patch on your source code every time the version gets updated is very expensive. For me, I had an early passion for open source. I do a lot of work in the nonprofit space personally. We deploy computers in schools in California that don't have computers, which is surprising, I know, but there are schools that don't have them. So we deploy open source software on those computers. I find this is a lot of fun, and I like sharing the work that I've done. And I tend to have a belief in having open access to technology and being in control of your architecture and your framework. One of the reasons some people get involved, it's really interesting to be able to collaborate internationally. Of course, I'm from the United States and I'm here talking to you today. Throughout my work in open source, I work with a lot of people from a lot of different countries. I travel a lot to go to open source conferences, and I work with people from various companies. So even though I work for HP, my colleagues are people from companies like Rackspace, IBM, Mirantis, all kinds of different technology companies. Because I'm working on open source software, my colleagues are people from other companies also working on the same thing. It also allows you to be part of some of the biggest software projects in the world. I grabbed this statistic from netcraft.com. Over half the active websites in the world are running Apache, which is open source. Another sliver is running Nginx, which is another open source version. The proprietary number has been trending down. More people are using open source software. I'm sure you've heard of Firefox. That's an open source project. And then Linux pretty much powers most of the cloud. There's Microsoft Azure, but that's a pretty small part of the market. Amazon and other clouds, everything running on OpenStack is running Linux. And I looked up the statistics, 97% of the top 500 supercomputers are running Linux. I think another like 3% is running Unix, and then the last percent that doesn't exist is Windows. I think like 1 maybe runs Windows. It's also been made clear recently that in addition to coming up with innovative solutions, open source has developed innovative software practices. So from time to time, I'll consult internally at HP, talking with organizations and products they want to open source. And there's this old development model where you all sit in a room, talk about a feature, and then you merge in this 10,000 line code merge that is your new feature. Open source has taught us that that is not the best way to do software development. Instead, you want incremental changes, small patches to the source code, and then code review by your peers. This has been really pioneered by open source projects in the past few years, and it's made for higher quality software and more review of the software by more people. There's also a lot of continuous integration happening, which is software testing as the code is going in and right after the code is merged. So there are a lot of open source projects around continuous integration. And that's actually what I work on for HP on OpenStack. Every piece of code that's committed to the OpenStack repository is tested before it's committed to the repository. So we always have a working development branch in addition to the stable branches that we release. And then also, there are a lot of tools used by open source projects that are now used inside companies. A division of the team that I work on at HP actually has an exact copy of our continuous integration system we use in OpenStack running inside of HP for some of HP's products. So that innovation that was developed in open source is now actually being used inside of a company for all kinds of different projects from open source to proprietary. Another reason you might want to get involved with open source, I don't know how many of you are students or who are not in technology today, but it is a wonderful way to build up to do some professional development. When I was working in open source early on, I didn't have experience in technology. I didn't have a degree in technology. I was working on other things, but I was interested. And through my work in open source, I was able to gain a lot of experience that I could put on my resume. I was able to work in the evening, play around with a few things, and get real experience working on real projects. It also gave me really great online collaboration skills, which means I was better at communicating with people, not only across distance and cultures, but explaining complicated technical tasks through email and through chat. And that turned into really beneficial when I joined a company where I need to be explaining the work that I'm doing. So I'm going to ask real quickly, how many people here have contributed to open source projects? Okay, that's maybe like 10% or so. So hopefully this is this is not review for too many people. I wanted to talk a bit about the types of open source work, because at HP, I'm a systems administrator. I'm not a programmer. And a lot of people think with open source that you need to be a programmer. Those are the only jobs that exist in the industry. And I want to tell you that's not true at all. We employ people who do all kinds of things for the OpenStack project. And other companies also employ people to do a lot of things for various open source projects. So I'll say the first one on my list here is programming. You know, you need to write code to have an open source project. There's also something we call software packaging. If you're running an operating system like Ubuntu, it is not just downloaded source code that runs on your computer. People have to take that source code and make it so it works inside of your Ubuntu operating system. So software packaging, if you want to look into that, if you're interested in getting involved, a lot of companies are hiring for that because they want people, or they want their software to run really well on Ubuntu or Red Hat or one of the operating systems that's popular in the industry. A lot of bugs are ignored, and that's really sad. So a lot of companies will spend time and money on hiring developers to work through the backlog of bugs so the software can be improved. Documentation was long ignored by open source projects, but we had to learn that documentation is actually hugely important to gaining contributors and users of the software. So a lot of people are hired as technical writers inside of open source projects. The documentation team for OpenStack, actually, it's growing, and there are several people paid to work on that. Some people do support as a job, whether it's through their own company's support network, where people are paying for support, or they're just contributing to the community to be a support person. There are many motivations for this, and one of the great things about support is that you only need to know a little bit more than someone else to answer their question, so it's got a very low barrier to entry. I mentioned that I do continuous integration at my job, so that's testing and quality assurance. There are a lot of people employed today on open source software who are doing testing. I think we hired a couple of people recently to do QA, making sure that the software is of high quality, and then investing time and telling the company where to spend time for developers, saying, you know, this part of the product isn't very good, we need to spend more developer time on that. I mentioned that I work on infrastructure as a systems administrator. All the infrastructure for the OpenStack project is open source. So our infrastructure itself that runs the wikis and the bots and everything that developers interact with is also open source software. And then there's things like working with the community, doing event coordination, and in general, just talking with people, talking with users. It's not really marketing. Community is very much about getting in touch with your community and encouraging developers. One of the things we do at HP is we also host some OpenStack events. So that's a really important part of getting in touch with operators and potential customers, potential contributors. So to get started with doing any type of work in open source, the first thing I suggest is finding a project. There are hundreds of thousands of open source projects out there, small ones, big ones. I'd suggest going to the website and finding a link about how to get involved. If they don't have one, you may not want to use that project as your first project. Because unless they're on GitHub and have a very clear method of contributing, I tend to take a sign of not having a contribute link as a sign of not being very highly developed and accepting new contributors. So typically you want to find a project that has an on-ramp for new contributors, so you can get help and you're not lost in a sea of source code or documentation, and you actually have mentors within the project. And then I say join the project, get involved in where they have their discussions. So if they have a chat room and you're comfortable with chat, joining that, you can join a mailing list, and you can just sit there and just read emails for weeks and not say anything on the mailing list. But you're sort of getting a feel for the community and understanding how they do development. And more importantly, finding out where they need help. The first open source project I worked on, I sat in their IRC channel, their chat channel, for about 2 months without saying anything. And then they said that they needed help with documentation. And I said, I could do that. How hard is that? Well, it was actually quite hard. But I made the contribution, and I got my name in a README file for the first time, and it was very exciting. And then, once you're comfortable, or if you already have a patch, go ahead and submit that patch to the project, whether it's documentation or programming or a patch to a package that's not installing right on your computer. Some guidelines, tips for making contributions. I'd say respect the work of other contributors. I've seen people join open source projects because they want to improve something. And the first thing they say is, this thing is horrible. Here's my proposal for a new thing. And they don't think that someone made that thing that you just called horrible. So you're coming into the project already calling someone's work not good. So I'd suggest not doing it that way, but respect that everything in the project was made by another person on your team. Also, you should follow the procedures in place for making contributions. Some projects take code directly from contributors on a mailing list. Some will ask you to add it to their code repository. Others will have a code review system like OpenStack does. But whatever it is for the contributions, I want to recommend that you follow the procedures in place. Sometimes people will send me personally a patch in email, and that's not really part of my workflow, and I don't really have time to review that because it's not in my day-to-day work. So it's really hard for me to accept that contribution, even though I really want to. So just if you follow the procedures in place, you'll have the highest likelihood of people liking you and people accepting your contribution. I also want to encourage you to follow through with commitments. And if you can't follow through with a commitment you make in an open source project, let them know as soon as possible. One of the most frustrating things of working on an open source project is having a volunteer who doesn't really follow through. If they say, I can't follow through because something happened, or I got very busy, or they have some sort of excuse and they tell me, then that's fine. I will happily work with that person again. But if they take on a task in my project and then they disappear for 3 months, I'm not really likely to trust them again. So following through with commitments, even when you're a volunteer on a project, is really important for building your reputation in the community. I also want to encourage you to be involved, but only really offer constructive criticism and discussion. So if you're involved on a mailing list, you probably want to stay quiet until you have something serious to say. You don't want to waste people's time. If you have questions, then by all means ask them. But make sure that your discussion is constructive. And then I want to encourage you also to collaborate with existing projects. It's very tempting when you get involved with open source software to fork the code, so you copy it into your own repository and then you name it after yourself. People really love doing that. But I want to encourage you not to do that, because you're then taking on the maintenance burden of an entire project that may have dozens or hundreds of contributors, and now that's all your own. So definitely collaborate with existing products and become a name inside that project. You don't have to name the software after yourself or be the leader of a project to be important in an open source community and a respected member. I also encourage you to be visible in your community once you start doing work. So maybe you have a blog, or you're active on Twitter or Facebook, but talking about the work that you're doing is really exciting to people. Maybe you just submitted a patch to some code, and maybe that's a boring day-to-day thing for you, but talk about it on social media. Tell people that you just fixed this thing with your code. There was a bug in Ubuntu, which is a version of Ubuntu, which causes your screen to go black. and not come back. And that was a very unfortunate bug. So when we fixed that bug, we told everyone in the world through our social media channels, and they were really happy because then they could upgrade their systems, and it worked really well. But by being an open source project and having that sort of relationship with our community, we're able to tell them things like that, like we just fixed this bug, it's really exciting, everyone upgrade. And if you're the person carrying that message, you'll build your reputation in the community. I also want to encourage you to go to events and conferences. Good job, welcome. If you get the opportunity, speaking at events is also really fun. Even if you're shy, I'm actually quite shy. But if you go to a conference and you have one of these cool speaker badges, people will talk to you and you don't need to walk up to them. So it's really cool, even if you're a shy person. You can get over it and talk to a whole audience. I also want to say, if you're typically shy of giving public interviews, get over that and actually say yes to every opportunity and every interview that comes your way. Because ultimately, it's not really about you if you're shy about talking about yourself. You'll be talking about the project and, again, building your reputation. Companies will see that you're giving interviews, potential employers, potential clients, and it's a really great way to get your name out there and support the project that you're working on. And then I also say engage with other users of the software. This can be either by going to conferences or being active on support forums or going into mailing lists. But being engaged with the community that you're part of is really important to getting your name out there. I found that my interactions with users has been really helpful because they then know who I am, invite me places. It's led to job offers and other similar things. And then be someone people want to work with. In open source, it may seem obvious that we do our work in the open, but that's not always the case. Sometimes people will hide for a couple of months and then come out with this new feature, and it's kind of disruptive to the project when people do that. So I recommend that you have a public plan, talk about it on the mailing list, the chat channel, and just be open about what you're working on. You also want to work in the same vein. You want to work in a way that shows off your collaboration skills. This is something that companies look for when they're hiring people. They want people who can communicate their plans and who work well with others. And then something that I learned pretty late in my open source career was mentoring new contributors is very, very important. You may believe that this takes away time from the time you have to spend on the actual project, but by having mentees, people that you're mentoring, they can sort of take work off of your plate, and they're going to be the next generation of open source contributors in your project. And it's really important to have those mentorship relationships. They can also benefit you in your career later on. There are many people who I've mentored who have gone on to have amazing jobs at amazing companies and do really, really well. And they're now references for me to use. You know, it was 5 years ago that I mentored them, and now they can be a reference on my resume, which is really helpful. So I just wanted to wrap up by talking a little bit about actually going to get a job in one of these companies. So there are some things you can look for in a company. You can find a company that does just open source. We heard from Red Hat earlier. They're an open source company. You could look at an open source core company where the core is open source and then they have proprietary sections of it. There are a lot of jobs in that space that are only open source. There are some that are open source and proprietary, but there's a lot of room there for opportunity. You could also get a job at a company that is using open source and lets you contribute back. My first job in the industry was a job like that. I was a systems administrator, but I was also able to work on Debian packaging in my job. So my boss let me contribute, even though it wasn't really, it wasn't my full-time job open source, but I was able to contribute. You could also find a role at a larger nonprofit or company that has an open source division. So at HP, I work in HP Cloud, which has a division, my group, that works on open source exclusively. So while you may not think of HP as being an open source company, we definitely have sections of the company that are very open source friendly and have developers working full time on open source. That's really where the biggest opportunity growing right now is. Traditional tech companies hiring open source developers. A lot of these companies are also offering internships and getting involved with programs like the Google Summer of Code in order to support people getting involved with open source software for the first time. So definitely look for internships from big companies that are working on open source and different types of scholarship opportunities. HP just wrapped up a scholarship program where we were seeking to find women to work in OpenStack. So we put out a call for a scholarship. It wasn't very big, it wasn't a full internship, but it was a small scholarship. And I think we've got something like 120 replies from women around the world, and we can only accept 4 of them. So competition was pretty fierce. But these internships and sponsorship programs are really important for companies to find people. So seeking out these opportunities for the scholarships and internships can be a great way to get into one of these companies. And that was all I had. You can find me in the hallway later if you have any questions. I'm happy to chat and talk about my work and opportunities that are out there. Thanks.